My name is Margaret Sullivan. For nearly 18 years, I worked for Dalton Freight Services, a family-run logistics company based out of Michigan. I wasn't the face of the company, but I was the backbone. When trucks broke down in the middle of nowhere, I was the one who found a solution. When drivers called in sick, I found replacements. When storms hit, when deadlines loomed, when tempers flared, I stayed calm, organized, reliable. I knew every route, every driver, every client by name. In the early days, Dalton Freight wasn't much. Just 6 trucks and a rusted warehouse that flooded every spring. I started when I was 24, back when Mr. Dalton Sr. still ran things with a handshake and a promise. Over the years, the business grew, and so did my role. 5 years ago, after Mr. Dalton passed away, his son, Charles, decided to sell half the company's assets to a private investor. A quiet deal, brokered quickly. He needed cash for expansion. I was offered a chance to buy a share, not out of charity, but because I had proven myself, because they knew no one else cared about those trucks and those drivers the way I did. I didn't hesitate. I used everything I had, savings, a second mortgage on my home, to buy in. Half the vehicles, half the contracts with the independent drivers. Legally mine, but it stayed quiet. On paper, I was just operations manager. Charles wanted it that way. No fuss, no attention. And honestly, I didn't mind. I liked working in the shadows. I liked making things happen without having to make speeches. Until Carter Weller arrived. Carter was the new general manager, fresh off some corporate stint at a national carrier. He strutted into our modest offices like he was doing us a favor by existing. Slick hair, tailored suits, and a jawline sharp enough to cut glass. He shook hands with the board, smiled big for the company newsletter, and then started cutting. Small things first. A longtime mechanic offered early retirement. A dispatcher reassigned to different duties, which turned out to be fetching Carter's lunch. Then came the meetings. "You're too old-fashioned, Margaret," he said to me once, smirking. "You don't understand modern logistics. We need fresh blood, not relics." I said nothing. I let him think he was winning. The final blow came on a gray Friday morning. Carter called me into his office. No warning, no courtesy. "You're no longer needed here," he said bluntly. "You're dead weight. Effective immediately." I stared at him. I let the words settle. I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I smiled. Because Carter Weller, with all his fancy degrees and polished arrogance, hadn't bothered to learn the one thing that mattered. He had just fired the woman who owned half his trucks and half his drivers. And by Monday morning, Dalton Freight's entire operations would grind to a halt. I left the office that morning without a scene. No box of belongings, no tearful glances backward. Carter did not even bother to walk me out. His assistant, a nervous young woman named Holly, handed me a beige envelope with a generic severance offer and a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. I tucked it under my arm without reading it. It didn't matter. By the time they realized what they had done, no amount of severance would fix it. Out in the parking lot, I sat behind the wheel of my old blue Ford and let the engine idle for a few minutes. The sky was low and heavy, with the kind of steel-colored clouds that promised rain by afternoon. I stared through the windshield, feeling something settle deep inside me. Not anger, not sadness. Resolution. I pulled out my phone and opened my contacts. First, I called Ben Lewis, the lead driver I had known since he was a hot-headed 22-year-old fresh off a farm in Indiana. Now, he was a reliable man in his 40s with 3 kids and a mortgage. He answered on the second ring. "Margaret? You all right?" "I'm fine, Ben. Listen carefully. As of noon today, I'm officially out at Dalton Freight." Silence. "Wait. What?" "I'll explain later. Right now, I need you to pull the keys from every vehicle under my contract. You, Terry, Russ, Maureen, all of you, secure the trucks. Park them at the secondary lot we set up last year. You remember the one. Ben whistled low under his breath. You're serious? As a heart attack. He didn't hesitate. Consider it done. One by one, I made the calls. Terry Sims, who had worked 2 jobs just to put his daughter through nursing school. Russ Collins, who had once driven through a blizzard for 16 straight hours to deliver emergency supplies. Maureen Price, who could back a rig into the tightest loading dock better than any man in the company. These were not just drivers. They were my people. And they were loyal. Because I had always been loyal to them. Paid them fairly. Fought for their bonuses when Charles balked. Bought new GPS systems with my own money when the company couldn't afford it. They remembered. By 2 in the afternoon, Ben texted me a photo. A long line of parked trucks at the secondary lot, keys secured, engines silent. I smiled. Meanwhile, back at Dalton Freight, Carter would be preparing for Monday's shipments without realizing that half his fleet was no longer at his disposal. And without those trucks, without those drivers, the contracts would fail. Deliveries would be missed. Clients would rage. Penalties would mount. I did not have to sabotage anything. I did not have to shout or accuse. I simply reclaimed what was mine. I spent the rest of that weekend quietly, answering a few worried calls from drivers, double-checking contracts, making sure every legal I was dotted, every T crossed. By Sunday evening, I felt a peace I hadn't felt in years. Not because I was destroying something, because I was finally refusing to carry it alone. Monday morning, Dalton Freight's operations would come to a grinding, humiliating halt, and Carter Weller would have no one to blame but himself. Monday started like any other day, except it wasn't. I knew Carter would arrive around 7:30, coffee in hand, barking orders into his Bluetooth headset like he was commanding an army. I also knew what he expected. A normal day, a list of deliveries moving out smoothly, invoices coming in, shipments moving like clockwork. Instead, by 8 o'clock, the first signs of unraveling would begin. I sat at my kitchen table, sipping coffee from a chipped white mug, watching the clock and waiting for the world to catch up to the truth. The first call came at 8:15. Ben. "Margaret," he said, voice tight, barely containing a laugh. "They're losing their minds." I chuckled quietly. "What's the situation?" "Dispatch is in chaos. They realized half the trucks are gone. Carter's screaming that it's sabotage. He's threatening to call the police." I leaned back in my chair. "Let him. Every vehicle was moved under contractual authority. They have no grounds." Ben laughed harder now. "I figured. Just thought you'd like to know." More texts came flooding in throughout the morning. Terry. "He just realized he has no one left for the Midwest runs. Clients are threatening to cancel." Maureen. "Warehouse manager walked out. Said he's not babysitting a sinking ship." Russ. "Carter's locked in his office. Conference call with the board in 10 minutes. Rumor is the clients are furious." I could almost picture it. Carter pacing, red-faced, scrambling for answers that didn't exist. By 10:30, my phone rang again. This time, not from a driver. It was Philip Dalton, Charles's younger brother, one of the original owners. "Margaret," he said, his voice rough with something that sounded suspiciously like regret. "Can we talk?" I paused, letting the silence stretch for a heartbeat. "Talk about what, Philip?" He cleared his throat. "About how we fix this." I smiled, not cruelly, but sadly. "There's no fixing what you broke," I said quietly. "You put the wrong man in charge. You let him treat loyal people like garbage. You didn't think it would cost you." He sighed heavily. "We didn't realize." "You didn't want to realize," I corrected him. Another long pause. "What would it take," he said finally, "to bring you back?" I laughed then. Not bitter, but clean. A sound of release. I'm not coming back, Philip. I'm not here to save you from yourselves. Silence. But, I added, softening my tone slightly, I'm willing to discuss selling my assets, if the terms are right, because I didn't want the trucks back. I didn't want the drivers caught in limbo. They deserved stability, not another battle. Philip exhaled sharply, understanding. I'll set up a meeting, he said. Good. I hung up and stared out the window, watching the wind move the budding branches of the old oak tree outside. It wasn't revenge I felt. It wasn't even triumph. It was something harder to name, the deep, solid satisfaction of knowing I had honored myself, that I hadn't let someone else define my worth. And somewhere in that office, Carter Weller was learning a lesson he would never forget. You can't fire the foundation without bringing the whole house down. Tuesday morning, I met Philip Dalton at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where no one asked questions, and the coffee never stopped flowing. He was already there when I arrived, nursing a chipped white mug, looking older than I remembered. The last few days had aged him. I slid into the booth across from him, setting my leather folder neatly on the table. Margaret, he said, voice hoarse, thank you for agreeing to meet. I nodded once. Let's not waste time, Philip. You know what's at stake. He exhaled heavily. We've lost 3 major contracts already. Clients don't want to hear excuses. They're pulling their business. I sipped my coffee, letting him sit in the mess he helped create. We need the trucks back, he said bluntly. The drivers. We need operations up and running again before the rest of our clients walk. I tilted my head. And you think you can just buy me out, nice and simple? His cheeks flushed. We're prepared to make a fair offer. I smiled thinly. Philip, I put 18 years into this company. I carried it when no one else wanted to. I saved it more times than you even realize. You don't get to define what's fair. He opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. Good, he was learning. I opened my folder and slid a piece of paper across the table. My terms, I said simply. He picked it up, eyes widening as he read. It wasn't just a sale price. It was a full package. Fair compensation for the trucks, the contracts, the goodwill I had built with the drivers, plus a non-compete agreement barring Dalton Freight from hiring back any driver who chose to stay independent under my new venture for the next 3 years. Because yes, I had already filed paperwork for a new company. Small, lean, driver-owned. Freedom. Philip swallowed hard. This is substantial. I shrugged. You're free to decline. He stared at me, the reality sinking in. Without my fleet and my drivers, Dalton Freight wouldn't just limp. It would die. And worse, their reputation would rot beyond repair. We'll need a few days to review, he said finally. You have until Friday, I said, standing. After that, the offer expires. I left him sitting there, paper clutched in his hands, the weight of consequences settling heavy on his shoulders. Driving home, I felt no guilt. No second guessing. Carter Weller thought he could erase me. Philip thought he could beg me back on his terms. Neither understood that the woman they underestimated for years had built something stronger than titles or paychecks. I had built relationships, trust, and those things didn't crumble with a termination letter. They grew roots. They endured. That afternoon, Ben called again. We're all in, he said simply. Whenever you're ready. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the tears sting, not from sadness, but from something deeper. Gratitude, vindication. Soon, I said. Real soon. Because whether Dalton Freight survived or not, my path was clear now. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was building something better. Something no one could ever take from me again. By Wednesday afternoon, the rumors started spilling beyond Dalton Freight's walls. whispers among clients, mutters among local businesses, a ripple spreading faster than any official press release could contain. Dalton Freight, the once reliable staple of regional logistics, was crumbling. I knew it was only a matter of time before the vultures circled. One of them called me that evening. "Margaret Sullivan?" A clipped professional voice said when I picked up. "This is Nolan Pierce, with Granite Haulage." Granite Haulage, our biggest competitor, a company that had been trying to undercut Dalton Freight for years. "I'm familiar," I said coolly. "I heard you're in transition," he said, trying to sound casual. "I'd like to talk about opportunities. For you. For your drivers." I let the silence stretch just a heartbeat too long. "Not interested," I said finally. He pressed on. "We're prepared to make it worth your while. Very worth your while." I could almost hear the grin stretching across his face through the phone line. They smelled blood in the water, but what they didn't realize, what no one quite grasped yet, was that I hadn't burned the house down to move into someone else's. I had cleared the ground to build my own. "I appreciate the call," I said, voice steady, "but I'm not for sale." Before he could respond, I hung up. I sat there for a long moment, the phone still warm in my hand. It would have been easy to sell out, to take the highest bidder and walk away richer than I'd ever dreamed. But that was never the point. The point was to build something different, something better. I owed that much to myself. I owed that much to the drivers who had stood by me without hesitation. Thursday morning, I met with Ben, Terry, Maureen, and a few of the other drivers at the secondary lot. They brought folding chairs, thermoses of coffee, and the kind of quiet determination that made my heart ache with pride. We sat in a rough circle, the spring sun warming our backs, and went over the plans. A small fleet, regional contracts, fair pay structures, ownership stakes for senior drivers, real safety measures, not lip service, a company that respected the people who kept it alive, the way it always should have been. "We're with you, Margaret," Ben said, his voice thick. "Whatever it takes." I nodded, feeling the weight of their trust settle across my shoulders like a mantle. "Then let's get to work," I said. Across town, I knew Dalton Freight's board was panicking. Their client list was bleeding. Their reputation was shot. And Carter? Word was, he hadn't shown up at the office since Monday afternoon. Typical. When the pressure came, the ones who built nothing always ran first. But we, the ones who built, who stayed, who endured, we stood. And we were about to rise. By Friday morning, the silence from Dalton Freight was louder than any apology. I knew they were struggling behind closed doors. Word on the street was brutal. Late deliveries, angry clients, drivers quitting mid-shift. And Carter? No one had seen him since Monday. Some said he fled back to his old city job, leaving the mess behind for others to scrub. It didn't surprise me. Men like Carter were never built for real storms, only for boardrooms where people clapped for the sound of their own voices. I wasn't waiting for them anymore. That morning, I met Ben, Maureen, Terry, and a few others at the new lot we had leased outside the city limits. It wasn't much yet, a patch of cracked asphalt surrounded by chain-link fencing. But it was ours. There were no gold nameplates, no velvet-lined offices. Just trucks lined up like soldiers, and a battered trailer that would serve as our first dispatch center. We walked the perimeter together, mapping routes, talking contracts, planning schedules. Ben brought coffee in a giant thermos that tasted like burnt rubber but warmed the hands. Maureen passed around handwritten notes, rough drafts of what would one day become driver-owner agreements. It was humble work, the kind that dirties your boots and stains your fingers with ink and grease. It felt like freedom. When the midday sun was high, I sat on the back bumper of my truck, watching the others debate parking layouts, and pulled out my phone. There it was, A new message from Philip Dalton. Meeting requested, noon, our office. No apology, no acknowledgement of the power dynamic, just desperation wrapped in false professionalism. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. They would dance the same dance they always did, pretending this was still a negotiation, when in reality, they had already lost the ground under their feet. At 11:30, I pulled into Dalton Freight's main lot, the familiar ache in my chest strangely absent. The building looked smaller now, duller, like a carcass of something once living. Inside, the reception area was nearly deserted. Holly, Carter's former assistant, gave me a brittle smile and waved me through without a word. She didn't look at me directly, and I didn't blame her. The boardroom was colder than I remembered, as if the walls themselves braced against what was coming. Philip sat at the head of the long table, flanked by two other senior members, who looked like they had not slept in days. He gestured to a chair, but I remained standing, setting my folder neatly on the table. "We've reviewed your terms," he said, clearing his throat. "We're willing to agree to most of them. However, we have concerns about the non-compete clause." I smiled thinly. "Of course you do." "It's extensive," one of the other men added weakly. 3 years is a long time to bar former employees from rejoining us. "You didn't seem concerned about loyalty when you fired me without notice," I said, my voice low and even. "You don't get to play victim now." Philip's mouth tightened, but he nodded slightly. He knew. They all knew. "You have until the end of today," I said, sliding a pen across the table. "After that, the offer is off the table, and your competitors will be very interested in picking up what's left." They didn't argue. They didn't threaten. They had nothing left to bargain with. I turned and walked out without waiting for a reply, the heavy door swinging closed behind me like a final chapter slamming shut. In the parking lot, I breathed deep for the first time in days. The spring air smelled sweeter now, touched with the faint scent of rain and clean beginnings. By tonight, I would either own my freedom fully, or I would watch Dalton Freight sink under the weight of its own arrogance. Either way, I had already won. By late afternoon, the clouds began to gather over Dalton Freight, both literally and figuratively. I sat in my truck outside the lot, watching the dark line of thunderheads roll in over the city skyline, feeling the storm press down on the world with heavy hands. It felt fitting, almost poetic. Everything was coming to a head. At 4:15, my phone rang. I didn't need to check the caller ID. I knew it would be Philip. His voice, when it came, was flat, defeated. "We accept your terms." I closed my eyes briefly, allowing myself a small moment of quiet satisfaction. I had fought long and hard for respect that should have been mine from the beginning, and now, at the end, they handed it over not with gratitude, but with the reluctant hands of men who had run out of options. "Send the documents to my attorney," I said evenly. "He'll finalize the signatures." Philip muttered something about expediency and paperwork, but I barely listened. In truth, there was nothing left to say between us. No apology, no grand gesture could erase what had already been broken. Trust, once shattered, rarely fits back together without scars. By 6 o'clock, the final contracts were signed. By 7, the wire transfer confirmation hit my phone screen. Just like that, a chapter 18 years long was over. Not with ceremony, not with fanfare, but with the quiet finality of a door clicking shut. I didn't celebrate. There was no champagne, no grand speeches. Just me, sitting at my kitchen table, the low hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. I thought about Mr. Dalton Sr., the man who had first given me a chance, who had believed in loyalty over pedigree, hard work over appearances. I wondered what he would think of what his sons had done to his legacy, and what I had been forced to do to protect my own dignity. Maybe he would have understood. Maybe he would have even been proud. The next morning, I drove out to the secondary lot. Though after today, it was no longer a backup. It was our home now. The drivers were already there, trucks lined up neatly, the battered trailer buzzing with low conversations and clattering coffee mugs. When they saw me, they cheered. Loud, heartfelt, genuine. I raised my hand, a little embarrassed, but their smiles only grew wider. We gathered around in a rough circle, no podiums, no titles, just people who had weathered a storm together and survived. I told them the truth, that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that we'd be building from scratch without the safety nets bigger companies took for granted, that every mile we logged would be earned the hard way. But I also told them the other truth, that they were no longer working for men who saw them as numbers on a ledger. They were building something they could own, something they could be proud of. Ben clapped me on the back hard enough to make me stumble. Maureen winked. Terry offered me a new mug. Plain white, but on it someone had scrawled in black marker, "Boss Lady." I laughed for the first time in what felt like months. We were free, we were ours. And whatever came next, we would meet it head-on, together. Across town, I imagined Dalton Freight's offices growing colder, emptier, as clients disappeared and trust evaporated like water on a hot griddle. Let them feel what it was like to be abandoned. Let them sit in the ruins they had built for themselves. I was done carrying that weight. I had other roads to travel now, and this time I would drive them on my terms. The next week passed in a blur of paperwork, late nights, and endless small victories. It was the kind of work that never made headlines, but built the foundations of something real. We chose a name for the company. Not flashy, not corporate, but something that felt honest. True Line Logistics. A nod to the roads we knew, the straight answers we gave, the promises we intended to keep. Ben handled the permits, Maureen helped negotiate the first local contracts, and Terry, with his slow and steady way, organized the routes and maintenance schedules. Every driver pitched in somehow, not because they were told to, but because they knew this was theirs too. Every hour, every wrench turned, every form signed. It was all investment, all ownership. Our first small office was barely more than a converted trailer parked beside the lot. But when we hung the new sign, a simple wooden board with bold black letters, it felt like christening a ship. I stood back and looked at it for a long time, feeling a kind of pride that no corporate award or hollow title had ever given me. The official launch day was a Thursday. No ribbon cutting, no speeches for the newspapers. Just coffee brewed too strong, a few hastily slapped together sandwiches, and every driver gathered in the early morning light, ready to roll out under a name that finally meant something. I stood in front of them, hands tucked into the pockets of my jeans, the cool spring wind tugging at my jacket. I wasn't good with speeches. I never had been, but I didn't need fancy words. "You built this," I said simply, my voice rough but steady. "Every mile, every delivery, every long night on the road. This company's not mine, it's ours. Let's make it something we can be proud of." They didn't cheer. They didn't need to. Their nods, their steady eyes, that was enough. One by one, the trucks rolled out of the lot, their engines rumbling low and strong like a chorus, setting out on their first jobs under the True Line banner. I watched them go until the dust settled and the lot stood quiet again. Later that day, I found myself alone in the small office, sorting through a stack of paperwork when a knock came at the door. It was Maureen, holding 2 cups of coffee and a small battered envelope. "We found this in the back of your truck," she said, handing it over. "Figured you might want it." Curious, I opened the envelope. Inside was an old photograph, a faded snapshot of Dalton Freight's first 6 trucks, lined up crookedly outside the original warehouse. A younger version of myself standing off to the side, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp and hopeful. For a long moment, I just stared at it, feeling the weight of those years press against my chest. Not regret, never regret, but acknowledgement. Those years had shaped me, yes. They had hurt me, yes. But they had also built something stronger inside me than betrayal could ever break. I slipped the photo into the bottom drawer of my desk, not to hide it, but to honor it. A reminder that every ending, no matter how painful, carries the seeds of something new. By sunset, the trucks were already beginning to return, some drivers dropping by the lot to share how smoothly things had gone, laughing over cheap coffee and the thrill of finally working for themselves, not for someone else's bottom line. As I locked up for the night, I stood alone under the wide open sky, watching the last sliver of daylight bleed away into the horizon. This wasn't the end of the road. It was just the beginning. And this time, I wasn't driving someone else's route. I was drawing my own map. The first weeks at Trueline Logistics were a blur of long days, late nights, and small victories that tasted sweeter than any promotion I had ever been handed in the past. Every delivery made, every invoice paid, every client phone call returned on time. It all stacked up like bricks in a wall we were building from scratch. There were no corner offices or big bonuses waiting for us. Just the quiet, steady satisfaction of doing honest work for honest pay, on our terms. We didn't advertise much at first. We didn't need to. Word of mouth carried faster than any billboard could. Drivers who had once felt invisible were now treated like partners, and it showed. Clients noticed the difference too. Deliveries were on time, issues were handled without excuses, and contracts were honored with handshakes that actually meant something. Our reputation grew 1 mile, 1 shipment, 1 grateful handshake at a time. I kept my head down through it all. Success didn't make me cocky, it made me cautious. I knew how easily a good thing could be undermined if you forgot why you started in the first place. We operated lean. We reinvested every extra dollar back into the company. New equipment, better maintenance schedules, fair bonuses. Every decision was made around a folding table with coffee-stained minutes and scribbled notes, not in some ivory tower. Meanwhile, the news about Dalton Freight trickled in from old contacts and whispered conversations. It wasn't dramatic. No newspaper headlines, no grand public collapse, just a slow bleeding out. Their best clients left first, then their suppliers tightened terms, then the few drivers they had managed to hold on to started slipping away one by one. The last I heard, they were trying to sell the remnants of the company to a competitor for pennies on the dollar. Carter Weller's name had vanished from the industry entirely, like he had never existed. I didn't waste time gloating over their fall. I didn't need to. The best revenge wasn't seeing them fail. It was watching my people thrive. It was hearing Terry laugh again after 3 years of silence. It was seeing Maureen's son bring her lunch because she finally had time to sit down during her shift. It was Ben finally putting in for vacation without fear of looking replaceable. One afternoon, about a month after our launch, I stood alone on the lot, watching the trucks roll back in as the sun dipped low on the horizon. I thought about all the women I had known over the years. Women who had given everything they had to companies that treated them like afterthoughts. Women who stayed quiet, who carried the weight because they believed loyalty was its own reward. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But standing there, I realized something deeper. Loyalty should never mean sacrificing yourself for people who would never bleed for you in return. We had built something better here. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next bad decision from someone who thought they owned me. I was looking forward. Finally. One evening, a few months after we rolled out our first deliveries under Trueline Logistics, I stayed late at the lot, sitting alone outside the office trailer. The trucks were all parked. The yard was quiet, and the sky overhead stretched wide and endless, dusted with stars. I nursed a cup of lukewarm coffee and listened to the hum of distant highway traffic, thinking about how different my life had become in such a short time, and how much of it I had almost given away without even realizing. The old habits were hard to shake. There were still mornings when I woke up bracing for an angry email or a backhanded insult disguised as a meeting. There were still moments when I caught myself second-guessing whether I deserved this peace, this respect, this second chance I had fought so quietly and so fiercely to earn. Years of being overlooked, underappreciated, taught you to expect disappointment. It wasn't easy to unlearn that. But then I would walk the lot and see Maureen laughing with her son by the maintenance shed, or catch Ben singing off-key while checking the tire pressure on his rig, or sit in a meeting where Terry, usually the most reserved among us, argued passionately about investing in better GPS systems because our drivers deserve the best. Those moments stacked up like stones in a foundation, sturdy, undeniable, real. This was what we had built, not just a company, a community, a place where people mattered more than profit margins, where loyalty was earned and honored, not demanded and discarded. I thought back to that gray Friday when Carter Weller had called me into his office, looked me in the eye, and called me useless. How sure he had been of his own importance, how small he had thought I was. He had seen an employee he could erase with a signature. He hadn't seen the woman who held half the company's future in her hands. In the end, it wasn't anger that stayed with me. It wasn't even the injustice of it all. It was the clarity, the certainty that I had survived not because someone gave me permission to, but because I chose to stand when it would have been easier to fall silent. Across town, Dalton Freight was now little more than a memory. A few rusted trucks in a shuttered lot, a faded sign swinging on broken hinges, a cautionary tale about what happens when you forget who really holds your company together. I never drove past it. There was no need. I had nothing left to prove to anyone there. My eyes drifted upward to the sky, where a plane blinked faintly in the distance, cutting across the darkness like a slow, steady promise. Somewhere out there, another woman like me was sitting in a silent office, wondering if she was crazy for wanting more, wondering if it was too late to fight for herself. I hoped she would. I hoped she would stand up, even if her hands shook. I hoped she would remember, the way I finally had, that being needed isn't the same as being valued, and that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to walk away and build something better with your own two hands. I smiled into the night, finished my coffee, and stood. There was still so much work to do, so many roads left to drive, but this time they were mine. All of them.